So I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Chintan Manotra. And ma'am, over to you for our first session. Please introduce our first speaker for the day.
Thank you, Inasha, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this session on cross-linking. So are my slides visible?
Yes,
okay, thank you. Yes, so basically the purpose of this course is to, as the topic suggests, corneal cross-linking for every ophthalmologist. So the purpose is basically to be able to do what most of us have with the simple machines, the riboflavin which is available, and to deal with scenarios which we see in everyday clinical practice. Of course, we will be dealing with, we will be making a passing reference to some of the newer advances, but the basic purpose, as the title suggests, is to see what every one of us who's seeing patients who may not be a cornea specialist, but who's seeing patients who come in for cross-linking, to clarify some concepts so that they are able to do a cross-linking safely and effectively. For this instruction course with me, I have my two co-instructors, Professor Arun Jain and Professor Amit Gupta. We are all at the Cornea Lens and Refractive Services of the Advanced Eye Center, PGI Chandigarh, and we look forward to hearing from all of them. Just to have a brief outline of the course, we will be taking you through these topics of when and when not to cross-link, how to cross-link thin corneas, post-LASIK ectasia, pediatric corneas, complications, and just then some tips and tricks to take away. In the interest of continuity, Professor Amit Gupta will be taking two of his talks together, that is when and when not to cross-link, and cross-linking the pediatric cornea, what can I expect together, since they are linked together. I don't think we are joined by Professor Jain yet because he's in a simultaneous session, and we hope to be joined by him soon. Thank you so much, and over to you, Dr. Amit. Dr. Jain is also there. Thank you, sir.
So, with the Hoya platform, I think we have used VisionX.
I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, sir. We see.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Chintan, and for letting me be a part of this very interesting instruction course. And what I'll be talking about is when to and when not to cross-link. And this is actually a very, very difficult topic, because if you look at the publications, I think there must be more than 7,500 publications. And we have to, draw our own conclusions as to the relevance of the data which is presented. And for the sake of continuity, I requested Dr. Chintan to that we should present cross-linking in the pediatric cornea in the same go. Now, I read in one of the editorials that cross-linking is the primary aim of collagen cross-linking is to stop the progression of keratoconus. And therefore, if the pathology is stable, the procedure is not indicated. And let's see if it is true by the end of my talk. It took 13 years for the FDA to approve corneal collagen cross-linking from 2003 to 2016. And this is because they said that the data was just not reliable and the studies were not conducted and the kind of sample that was included in the studies. Now, the things that we should know to decide when to cross-link. One is, what will happen to a patient with keratoconus in case you do not cross-link? In other words, the natural history of a patient of keratoconus. What does cross-linking do? What kind of patients are suitable? Which patients are unsuitable? And a knowledge of modifications of the procedure, which may help to make the procedure safer in these circumstances. So all these things are very important to know. And do I really need to cross-link now, or can I wait? And the knowledge of the complications of the cross-linking, on which we have one session, and which is the basis of the caution that we are exhibiting in these patients. And some special situations which might warrant aggressive intervention. So, as regards the natural progression of keratoconus, a detailed knowledge of the natural history of keratoconus is fundamental in making informed decisions on when their benefits outweigh the risks of the procedure. And these authors, they retrospectively reconstructed the natural history using control eyes of patients of studies of cross-linking. And did a very detailed analysis of each and every component of these keratoconic eyes. And they found that at the end of 12 months, which is the inclusion criteria in this study, age less than 17 years and patients with Kmax steeper than 55 diopters, it was recommended, are at the highest risk of progression of keratoconus. Another interesting trial was the KeraLink randomized control trial, which is published in Ophthalmology 2021. Now, this studied the effect of collagen cross-linking versus standard care on keratoconus progression in young patients. Difficult study to carry out considering so many people are doing cross-linking. Now, there were 60 participants. We had 30 participants who underwent cross-linking and 30 were observed. The mean age was 10 to 16 years. And there was a mean Kmax value in the groups was 56.5 diopters. The follow-up was 18 months. So they found that at the end of 18 months, the progression was much more in patients who had not received cross-linking, to the tune of 53.4 diopters after the main K2, compared to 49.7 K2 at the end of 18 months. They concluded that keratoconus progression in the study eye is more likely to occur if they have not undergone cross-linking. In their study, 7% of the patients who underwent cross-linking underwent a progression compared to 43% who were randomized to standard care. It's a very compelling evidence to cross-link, especially in younger patients. So what is cross-linking and what does it do? So this was, it's known by the Dresden Protocol because it was first actually established in a meeting which was held in Dresden by Wolinczak and Thusiller. And what happens is that the ectatic cornea is weak and it lacks the bonds between the collagen fibers. And when we put riboflavin dye and we expose it to UVA light of 360 wavelength, what happens is that there's a reaction. There are two types of reactions, anaerobic and aerobic reaction. And one leads to riboflavin radicals being produced, and the other leads to a singlet oxygen, which is the basis of the cross-linking which occurs. So after cross-links, the cornea becomes stiffer and more resistant to the changes due to the formation of the covalent cross-links. Possibly, this is the only technique which can stop the progression of corneal ectasia. Now, because of this presence of oxygen, which is critical in the effect of this procedure, it has led to various number of protocols. Now, when we talk about thin corneas, I'm not addressing that because that will be talked about by Dr. Chintan later on. But there's a Dresden protocol, which is the standard protocol: remove the epithelium, put the riboflavin dye, and expose it to UVA light. There's a Creighton protocol: you remove the epithelium by PTK. There's an accelerated cross-linking, which is said to, be faster. There's customized cross-linking, which is supposed to be much more effective. There's pulse cross-linking. They say it improves the oxygen availability during the procedure. There's HPMC versus Dextran. There's Athens protocol. Sufficient to know that all these protocols are actually aimed at improving the efficacy or safety in some way. And these are a person should be aware of these protocols. If you look at the indications, cross-linking has been tried in many indications. However, in this particular talk, my focus is on just keratoconus. So which patients are suitable for cross-linking? Now, it's just not about the keratoconus patient. We have to consider the age of the patient. We have to consider whether the patient is rubbing his eye continuously, if there's any syndromic association or association with other collagen vascular diseases. Family history is important because they're more likely to progress. History of atopy is very important. And of course, in the end, last but not the least, the progression criteria for these patients. Now, Rohit Shetty et al., they have defined some kind of a high risk criteria for progression of keratoconus, including age, eye rubbing, atopic eye disease, frequent changes of glasses, and others, which include pregnancy, Down syndrome, and others. So if your score is more than 8, the patient is a high risk candidate for the progression of keratoconus. Imagine a situation. Now, this map on the left eye of this patient has a 389 Kmax pachymetry at thinnest location, whereas the right eye has 432. If this patient presents Your approach would probably be different if the patient is 10-year-old, 20-year-old, or 40-year-old or more. Why? Because at the age of 40, we might keep this patient under follow-up because he's much less likely to progress. There's a very interesting publication, which is the patient selection for collagen cross-linking. Now, what they have stressed on is a Cochrane review, which was carried out by Sikakis. Now, this review says that, they assessed out of all the trials, they shortlisted only 3 randomized controlled trials which fitted the criteria. So the aim of this was to assess whether there's an evidence that cross-linking is effective and safe treatment for halting progression of keratoconus compared to no treatment. And they concluded that the evidence for the use of cross-linking in the management of keratoconus is limited due to lack of properly conducted RCTs. So we keep talking about progression. So progression, is it simple to label a patient as progressive? Not always. On the right, it's such a jumbled kind of big chart, just one of the charts, different studies, which kind of criteria they have followed. So there are many criteria which are there. The global consensus on keratoconus, which was such a big consensus, and a Delphi panel, even they have said that the criteria, any 2, steepening of anterior surface, steepening of posterior surface, and thinning or increase in the rate of corneal thickness change. But they have failed to define it. What should be the criteria? How much of change should we keep? They have not defined in this publication. And this was addressed to some extent by a publication by Bell et al. So this was published in 2020. So these are recent publications. Now, they did pay attention to this fact. They said parameters over the past years. So in a standardized way, what we count as progression is Kmax increase more than 1 diopters, Kmax minus K minimum increase more than 1 diopters, increase in K mean of more than 0.75 diopters, a pachymetry decrease of more than 2%, a back optic zone radius of the best fitting contact lens 0.1 millimeter or more, and increase in central K of more than 1.5 diopters from baseline, increase in manifest cylinder from more than 1 diopter increase in 24 months, MRSC increase of more than 0.5 diopters, and other values. Even a single point is taken as an indicator. But the important thing is that the posterior elevation is not being considered. And we keep talking about, that how keratoconus is mainly a disease of the posterior corneal surface. We should use the existing technology when available. And the ABCD progression display by Michael Bellin is one of these. It takes into account changes in the anterior surface, posterior surface, thinnest pachymetry, and the visual acuity. The interesting part is it focuses on the 3 millimeter area zone of the thinnest cornea. So that is more likely to have the changes before other parts of the cornea, right? So this is one of the maps, and it gives us the confidence intervals where which patients are likely to progress and which patients are not likely to progress. So these are flagged entries. So if you have more than 2 entries which are in the red flagged area, they would indicate more than 95% of confidence interval that the patient is having progressive keratoconus. So can we predict which patient is going to need cross-linking or not? So this is another interesting study, and they concluded that at an age less than 20 years, an R minimum value, so R minimum value is seen on the pentacam, of the anterior surface predicted the risk of keratoconus progression and requirement of cross-linking. So I'm just feeding you these values so that these are all indicators that the patient is progressing. So ultimately, who to cross-link? 1, progressive keratoconus. 2nd, pediatric keratoconus. And 3rd, people with low corneal thickness. Why low corneal thickness? Because it might be that if they progress, they might not become suitable candidates for performing a standard Dresden protocol. And that is not something we really want to see in a patient of keratoconus. We have to consider other factors. What is the severity of the disease? What is the amount of visual loss in this patient? What is he reading? What is the refractive error? What is the condition of the other eye? So all these things have to be considered when we have to plan the cross-linking in these patients. So if you look at clinical scenarios, one is that the patient comes to you, he's under follow-up, and he has progressed and using so many of these criteria that I have enumerated. And so we take this patient up for cross-linking. There's a simple scenario. If a patient has made the first decision, and decision has to be made, what are we going to do? The first thing I ask the patient is, do you feel that you have worsened in the last 6 months to 1 year? And we also do we check the power of the glasses that the patient is wearing. If the patient is wearing a glass with the four spherical and -2 cylinder, and we do a refraction fresh, which comes out at 5 cylinder and 3 diopters of cylinder, I would take it as a progression in this patient. Weed out unsuitable candidates, corneal scarring, active ocular allergy, herpes, pregnancy lactation to a large extent, autoimmune disorders. All these things which affect the healing of the epithelium are also relative contraindications in these patients. Be aware of the possible complications. We have a talk, so I'm not going to address these, but we should be aware that every surgical procedure has a complication. There are special situations, for example, keratoconus progression in VKC, or if we look at the patients of, this is a study on Indian patients who went on to develop keratoconus, and they have noted that patients with younger age of onset, history of eye rubbing and atopic were significantly more at risk of developing eye drops. So we don't want that to happen, and we should go in for an early cross-linking. Also, cross-linking in pregnancy. There have been studies which have shown that especially in the 3rd trimester, there's a major chance that the patient is going to progress. And then it becomes very difficult at that stage to do a cross-linking for so many reasons. So we may consider counseling these patients that they should undergo cross-linking before they become pregnant, because there's a huge chance that they're going to progress. Patient with Down syndrome, we know they have a very high likelihood of having acute eye drops, and in that early treatment it's difficult because they have to be performed under GA, and often prolonged GA, it takes up to 1 hour. So all these things have to be considered when we are taking up these patients. To conclude, corneal cross-linking is an option that in the last decade has demonstrated its efficacy and safety in halting the progression of keratoconus and other corneal ectasias. Its indication has been extended beyond the classic definition that required the evidence of keratoconus progression, especially in the presence of some risk factors for a possible progression, particularly that of a younger age. However, the results can still be somewhat variable today, and there are several protocols, and each of them, they have their own advantages and disadvantages. I think ultimately the ophthalmologist has to decide what he wants to do. And some predictors of cross-linking outcome have been defined in these patients. When we look at pediatric patients, the considerations, the challenges are that many times the child doesn't complain that he has a visual problem. So there's late diagnosis, they progress faster. There's an unsuccessful conservative care in these patients. Accurate tomography is not possible, topography also, and it's difficult to control the eye rubbing behavior, as well as there's a need for frequent follow-ups of these patients. If you look at the prevalence, there's a huge difference in the prevalence in different regions. They say it's much more common in the Asian subcontinent. And one recent study from Saudi Arabia, it has found a prevalence of 1 in 25, huge, but this was in a limited cohort of patients. And another study from Lebanon also showed an incidence of 0.53%. So one thing is certain, there's a male predominance in these patients who present with keratoconus, and one of the earliest ages that has been reported is as early as age 4. So we should always be alert that it might be keratoconus. Just because the patient is 4 or 5 years old doesn't mean that he cannot have keratoconus. We know that keratoconus tends to be more severe and to progress more rapidly in children. So why? Because there are higher rates of corneal collagen remodeling, which were observed in pediatric corneas. We know that our tissues change as we age, and there's a natural cross-linking which occurs as we age. So that is not so in children. There's a dynamic environment. There are weak ectatic lamellae, which may exceed the capacity of cross-linking process, which leads to more rapid ectasia progression. We know that the size of the collagen fibrils increase as the patient ages. So at a younger age, it is lesser. There is a frequent coexistence of ocular pathology, such as atopy and vernal keratoconjunctivitis, that has been associated with faster progression and long-term complications in pediatric keratoconus. So together, there's a more debilitating progression with an increased likelihood of corneal opacity, subsequent keratoplasty, and eye drops, and so many other things. So if you look, compare it to the adult keratoconus, there's a more rapid, more aggressive course in children, especially those with central cones. So watch out for children with central cones, be more aggressive. And there's a lower, thinnest corneal thickness. And there's an increased corneal curvature, and there's a higher average central corneal keratometry. There's increased posterior elevation, all these things which lead to a worse outcome in these patients. And there are higher rates of progression. This is a very interesting paper by Chadzis and Habezi. And what they have done is they have studied 59 eyes of 42 children, both preoperatively and after the follow-up. And they found that the eyes which had been treated with should be treated with cross-linking as soon as the diagnosis is made. So they found a considerable difference in patients who had not undergone cross-linking. Similarly, there's another study of more than 2,700 patients over an 8-year period, and they identified younger age as an independent risk factor leading to keratoplasty in patients of keratoconus. And Sotters et al. Also reported that patients were progressing even up by 2.6 diopters very early in these patients, 2 to 5 diopters over a year. Now, if we look at the Dresden protocol cross-linking, we know that it works in adults, but it's also been shown to work in children. There are several studies to that. I will not go into detail of this. Some of our own experience at PGI Chandigarh, and we found that no doubt about it that there was a difference in the MRSE, which improved not only at 2 years, but at 5 years. This is 66 eyes, 66 pediatric eyes that we had. There was an improvement in the sphere and improvement in the cylinder. And what I want you to see is at 2 years as well as 5 years, because many studies have said that the effect of cross-linking wanes off after 2 years, and gradually by 5 years, then we might see a big reversal. In our study, we are analyzing these results, but I think more than 25% have shown overall these results look good, but if you see individually, I think more than 25% of these patients have now progressed at 5 years after responding at 2 years. And we can see that there is a change. The mean posterior K and posterior steep K, it's all looking good in these patients. So in our experience, in my personal experience, pediatric keratoplasty cross-linking works. To conclude, the field of pediatric cross-linking is yet to be fully addressed, and the current published literature on cross-linking is not as extensive for pediatric population as it is for adult population. Very few institutions do it. There's a risk of GA, and many of the local ophthalmologists may be reluctant to do it, and which places a lot of load on big institutes. Currently available evidence that the standard cross-linking Dresden protocol is at least temporarily effective in halting the progression and even improving the keratometry values in pediatric patients. There has been a demonstrated regression up to 3 years after treatment in some studies. Given the concern of regression of keratoconus after cross-linking in children, studies assessing the effect of cross-linking in pediatric patients should provide at least 5 years. So whenever we are analyzing the data, I think it has to be 5 years or more in these patients. Very, very few studies are there, or the patients are too less for us to draw a logical conclusion. Because of the evidence of rapid progression in most pediatric patients and the cost effectiveness of early cross-linking compared with standard traditional management of keratoconus with late keratoplasty, treatment on diagnosis, close monitoring should be considered. Thank you very much. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Supriya and Dr. Ashish in my treatment of these patients and my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. I think that was a difficult topic to cover, and which, because it has so many implications and so many nuances to it. And good afternoon, sir. Professor Jain, I think you were in an earlier session earlier. So you need to unmute your video. So your audio, yes. Good afternoon, sir. I just, sir, would you like to comment, have any comments, questions?
Discuss it together. Once you have your presentation on protocol, I think then
okay. Yeah.
to that.
Just one question for you, Dr. Amit, before we go on to the next talk, and that is, have you ever had to cross-link a child again repeatedly? Have you repeated it?
Yeah, I was expecting that. No, I have not. But I mean, we can discuss it later after your talk, I think. But I would say that in case I do have to cross-link a child again, we need to work out protocols for repeat cross-linking in children. We were analyzing our own data, and that has shown that some of the patients have, maybe they were very severe to start with, but they have had a recurrence of more than 5.5 diopters. So there has been an increase in K of more than 5.5 diopters. Maybe they are continuing to rub their eyes, and maybe there's so many factors are there in children. And perhaps a transepithelial cross-linking would be a good idea in case you have to, supplement your cross-linking. That is safer. It causes less scarring and so many other benefits I'm sure you'll address in your talk. So I think we have to be prepared to cross-link some of these corneas again.
Yeah, because they have a long time ahead and sometimes regression can occur. Okay, so we can discuss this later. We'll move on to the next talk, which is about cross-linking the thin cornea. I'll just start sharing my screen. So very good afternoon to all. The topic I'll be speaking on is cross-linking the thin cornea and how to keep it simple. Basically, how each of us can cross-link a thin cornea if the need be. Now, all of us in clinical practice keep seeing patients who are less than 400 microns, some 350, and we always wonder, we are in a dilemma whether we should cross-link or not cross-link. Now, the gold standard, which was the Dresden protocol, it gave the 400 micrometer rule for performing CXL. That is, to prevent endothelial damage, the corneal thickness after removing the epithelium must be 400 micrometers. Now, what was the reason for this? Various experiments had been done, and after those experiments, the recommended UV irradiation was that what would be adequate would be a 5.4 joules per centimeter square. It was started with a 3 milliwatt per centimeter square for 30 minutes. Now we also have the accelerated protocols, which however deliver the same fluence. Now the reason was that in a 400 micrometer cornea, the energy delivered to the endothelium is approximately 0.18 milliwatt square. And it was also determined that the threshold for damage to the endothelium was 0.35 milliwatt per centimeter square. So this 0.18 watts per centimeter square milliwatts provided a significant, almost 100% safety margin, and which is why this 400 micron rule was propagated, and we've been following ever since. So a corneal thickness less than 400 microns after removing the epithelium has conventionally been considered thin. But the thing is, now that advances in contact lens designs are there, we have the scleral contact lenses, the semi-scleral contact lenses. These allow good visual acuity even in eyes with very advanced ectasia. So if CXL can be performed safely in these patients and the progression halted, the need for surgery can be dramatically reduced or delayed, because we know surgery, the keratoplasties, be they lamellar or full thickness, have their own sets of complications. Various approaches have been described over time. These started from using the hypoosmolar riboflavin. Normally we use an isoosmolar, but so then you use hypoosmolar, which swells up the cornea. You have the customized epithelial debridement, where you remove the epithelium over, just don't remove the epithelium over the thin area. Then it started with the transepithelial, the contact lens assisted, the smile lenticule assisted, and the customized. Now, the first 5 approaches basically deal with an artificial increase in the thickness or the prevention of reduction of thickness in case of the transepithelial and the customized epithelial debridement. Whereas the last approach, which is the customized, that basically deals with adapting the energy to the existing thickness. And that is kind of a different way of looking at things the way we were doing them. Just a brief description and the advantages and drawbacks of these. So in hypoosmolar riboflavin, we are using the riboflavin without dextran. And after removing the epithelium, we swell the cornea to at least 400 micrometers. Now, the limitations for this, which have been proposed in various studies, are that we are actually artificially separating the collagen lamellae. We are creating fluid lakes in between. And so if we are separating them artificially, we can't really expect the cross-linking or the compaction of the cornea to occur very effectively, apart from the other factors like a lower diffusion factor and a poorer absorption coefficient of this riboflavin. Then we had the customized epithelial debridement, where at the thinnest part, on the steepest part of the cornea, the epithelium was left on and the rest was removed in an effort to preserve the thickness of this area. But the disadvantage of this is that it's also likely to block the ultraviolet A, because epithelium is known to block UVA and also block the oxygen. And studies have shown that with this kind of an approach, we see a shallower demarcation line in the area of the epithelial island vis-a-vis where the epithelium has been removed. This was also there where I was part of this work at Narayan Nethralaya in Bangalore, and we imaged the corneas in vivo while cross-linking was being done with a handheld in vivo OCT. And we saw that this hyperreflectivity, which is presumed to be because of riboflavin penetration, was much deeper in the areas where the epithelium was removed vis-a-vis where it was not removed. So that correlates with the fact that we can expect to have shallower demarcation lines in the area where the epithelium is not removed. And since that is the thinnest part of the cornea, which we actually want to cross-link, we are leaving the main area kind of not exposed to the proper treatment. Then we have the lenticule-assisted CXL, which was described by the group by Dr. Mahipal Sachdev and the team. The SMILE lenticules, which are used for while performing SMILE, are used in this. The advantage of this is it's a biologically similar tissue, but the downside is that there's a lack of availability to most of the practitioners. Contact lens assisted technique, another very elegant technique described by Dr. Susan Jacob et al., where we use a non-UV blocking contact lens made of Hilafilcon, no financial interest. It's soaked for 30 minutes in riboflavin. At the same time, we are also soaking the cornea. And before exposing the cornea to UVA light, this cornea is the contact lens is placed over the cornea. And they showed that approximately 100 to 110 micron thickness was artificially added in this way. Now, a critique of the CA-CXL is that the contact lens, unlike a SMILE lenticule, is not biological tissue. And studies on porcine eyes have suggested that CA-CXL induces only 2/3 of the biomechanical strength of CXL. But somehow clinical data does not appear to agree with the experimental findings, although there are not too many studies on CA-CXL. But all these findings seem to suggest that in a real-world scenario, CA-CXL appears to be sufficiently effective, if not better, at least comparable to conventional CXL. And we also published our experience in the Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery in 2017, and it was the same, that it is effective. So the other advantage of CXL is that there's no extra investment required or upgrade required in the CXL device, and you just need that extra contact lens. It's important that that contact lens should not block the UVA light. Transepithelial CXL is another technique which has come up. The concept and the proposed benefits are that if the epithelium is not removed, there would be less post-operative pain, reduced risk of infectious keratitis, less stromal haze, and an early return to contact lens wear. But the challenges or the disadvantages, one could say, are that, like I mentioned earlier, the UVA light is blocked by the epithelium, and there is limited penetration of riboflavin through the intact epithelial junctions because riboflavin is hydrophilic, whereas the epithelium is lipophilic. The latter part has, however, been overcome by changing the composition of the riboflavin dye. So dyes which we use for transepithelial cross-linking have chemical enhancers like EDTA or benzalkonium chloride. And also the concentration of the riboflavin has been increased from 0.1 to 0.25%. So what about the efficacy of CXL? The original report suggested that transepithelial CXL was associated with only a 60 to 65% increase of biomechanical strength, which was 1/5 that of the conventional CXL, and it had shallower demarcation lines. So doubts existed over its efficacy. What does current literature say about the outcomes of transepithelial versus conventional CXL? Now, this is a busy slide. Just to mention that some studies show benefits, some studies show that it is equivalent, some studies show that it's a little poorer. There is no clear consensus, though the balance does seem to be in favor of epi of CXL. However, there was this recent meta-analysis which had a large number of eyes published in Cornea in 2018, and they studied 227 eyes in epi-off and 228 in CXL. And again, they mentioned that transepithelial was comparable to standard epi-off CXL. This, I think, we'll discuss later. So when literature is conflicting, reflecting on personal experience helps. And so we've done a couple of studies on transepithelial because like that also has the advantage that you don't need any extra device, and where the epithelium is thin, you would want to go for a procedure which is perhaps provides more comfort to the patient. So we've seen very well demarcated, delineated demarcation lines in transepithelial CXL, and they have been almost to the tune of 75% depth. We've been using transepithelial, the riboflavin dye in 1.2% HPMC and not dextran, which is what is recommended for transepithelial cross-linking. The reasons for this I will mention in my second talk. And these are the examples of flattening seen in some patients of transepithelial CXL, which have been seen in the short term as well as the long term, as long as 3 years and 4 years. Not to say that failures are not there, but we have seen that they are to the tune same as seen for the conventional CXL. So my experience has been that a softer but clinically significant reduction of keratometry values is seen in most patients with transepithelial CXL. And this is a recent study which has been just accepted last week for publication. In this, we actually compared the real world data of contact lenses assisted CXL and transepithelial CXL, because these are the two techniques which I have been doing for thin corneas. And we saw that although the cornea was equally steep in both eyes and almost to the tune of 70 diopters in some patients, the results were comparable. So almost all eyes showed a 94 to 100% increase stabilization or regression, which is one of the parameters. The change in keratometry was comparable. It was a little more in the CA-CXL and epi of CXL, less in TA-CXL, but still clinically significant, almost a 2 diopter decrease. And the safety of all procedures was also equal. Except for in the conventional CXL, no patient lost any lines of visual acuity. So in this series, CA-CXL and transepithelial CXL demonstrated equal efficacy, and complications of all three techniques were minimal. The other thing that's new in cross-linking is topo-guided cross-linking, where you selectively cross-link the cornea where the area is thin, but this requires specific devices having these programs. So a newer perspective which is there is that you change the fluence. You decrease the energy. I'll just take 1 minute more. You decrease the energy. You decrease the time, keeping the energy same, so that the dose delivered is less. And they have very beautifully given these protocols where the duration of the time given is less depending on the corneal thickness. And they noted a stable topography in most of the eyes. So to conclude, cross-linking is an ever-evolving science. What we understand today may only be the tip of the iceberg. Treatment protocols are undergoing a paradigm shift, and thin corneas can be treated safely, but should be treated well in time with adequate precautions being taken. Thank you very much. And I apologize for overshooting the time a little bit.
Can I ask you a question, Dr. Chintan?
Yes, Dr. Amit.
How often do you do intraoperative pachymetry when you're doing, cross-linking in thin corneas?
So we do have the intraop pachymeter with us, and initially we had started doing once we were doing those series and measuring the intraop pachymetry, we were doing it routinely. But over time, I've seen that sometimes it becomes a little more cumbersome, and we are not, to be honest, doing it routinely all the time. What now I am doing is looking at the preoperative epithelium, because we have the epithelial mapping. I'll again be mentioning that. And if you feel that the epithelium, after removing the epithelium, the stroma is not going to be thin, then I'm not, as a routine, we are not doing it. We do have that available if the cornea is extremely thin. Let's say if it's 325, 330, I would be doing it, but not, let's say, if the cornea is 370, 380. I would like to hear the comments of the other panelists also.
Yeah, but I think especially in thin corneas, we have to do the pachymetry, and that should be the message which everybody should get. The second thing is that there are a lot of ophthalmologists and protocols which they say that we do not put the speculum in the eye, and we keep putting the dye, and then because that will avoid the compaction of the corneal stroma. Any experience with that? I personally don't do it. But I do instill the drops more frequently, and we make sure that the cornea is covered all the time to avoid evaporation and compaction of the stroma in these patients.
Yes, absolutely. So I've also never followed that, because even in studies which have removed the speculum, sometimes people have also used those special rings to maintain the pool of riboflavin over the epithelium. We are doing it with the speculum on, but like you mentioned, very frequent soaking of the thing. So every 3 minutes or every 2 minutes for the first 30 minutes. And even after that, once the irradiation is being done, the riboflavin is applied every 3 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes.
And, one more question is that, there was a wave of suggestions a few years back of you doing an intraoperative pachymetry after 30 minutes and then using distilled water to swell up the stroma to a level and then you add on the dye. What is your take on that?
To be honest, I have never gone for that hypoosmolar approach, whether it be the hypoosmolar riboflavin or the distilled water, because I do personally again think that we are separating the fibers, and the results with the hypoosmolar, there are no long-term results. There's in fact that original study where it has just showed 6-month results, and
No,
so
it's
I
not
have.
hypoosmolar dye. It is just that people are using distilled water, and they do a pachymetry. If it is less, use the distilled water. And so I've done a few cases. I
Yeah.
did at that time, and the results were good. The only thing is that because the available stroma is that much only, so they say that actually the effective amount of the cross linking of the tissue is less. So therefore, probably the effect would be less. But
Because the result would be the
many
same,
people-
like as the hypoosmolar or the distilled water, you're basically artificially swelling up. So what I have done over the years is do either a contact lens assisted and shifting more and more now to the transepithelial. Professor Jain sir, would you like to comment on this?
Your experience is much more than mine. I agree because the only drawback of that study with the hypo or smaller thing with distilled water is too much separation of the fibers, which leads to lesser effective cross-linking of the fibers. And as Dr. Amit already said, our long-term studies are not available. So I agree that maybe the future is to, in thin corneas, one has to do either a contact lens assisted or a transepithelial with the newer dyes which have a better penetration into the cornea. So, or maybe smile lenticle assisted, which is not available to everyone. So one has to make a choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. We would, I think, move on to the next talk. And so may I, since Dr. Amit has already spoken about his talk on pediatric cornea, may I request you to go ahead with both your talks, the post-LASIK ectasia and the complications? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Chintan, and thanks for having me on board for these two talks in your very well, very popular instruction course on this C3R. Uh, are my slides visible?
Not yet.
Are my not yet? Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, share. Okay. Okay, now visible?
Also. Yes.
Okay.
Not your slide.
Not your slides, sir.
Not visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, now there.
Okay. So I've been asked to speak on cross-linking on a cornea post-LASIK ectasia. Should we be doing things differently? I was trying to, search literature, and there is nothing, so different about it. Whatever Dr. Amit and Dr. Chintan has talked about, depending on the thickness, we follow the same protocol, and probably the effect of cross-linking is a little less in post-LASIK eyes. The reason for that, I'll come to that later on. But basically, there is no difference in way we approach the eye with the post-LASIK ectasia, and this is the definition for what has been given by the corneal ectasia after LASIK. There should be a minimum inferior topographic stiffening of 5 diopter or more compared with the immediate postoperative appearance, and there should be loss of 2 or more lines on snarl visual acuity, and the change of manifest reflection should be 2 diopter or more, either sphere or cylinder. And as we all know, the management option are many. First and the foremost is contact lens. And to stabilize the progression of the disease, C3R is the choice of treatment, which could be combined with intracorneal weakness segments, or maybe with PRK to regularize or or correct some degree of refraction. And the last resort when nothing works is corneal transplantation. And post-laser in situ keratomycosis, current understanding, these are the various risk factors which can lead to post-LASIK ectasia in the paper by Rendelmet et al. In 2006. And the incidence is not very high, and the risk factor they recognize are, one is the younger age group, high myopia, or when the residual bed was less than 250 micron, or preoperative central corneal thickness less than 500 micron, or where the keratometry is more than 47 diopter, and especially with against the rule astigmatism, and patient with subclinical or formless keratoconus, and probably trauma related to excessive eye rubbing. And of course, as already Amit has highlighted, pregnancy, post-LASIK pregnancy can sometimes induce ectasia because of hormone changes which happens in the body during the second and third trimester of pregnancy. And I will discuss one case. Again, this is case from Dr. Chintan's clinic. She's a 30-year-old female teacher who had progressive diminution of vision for last 2 years, and she had undergone LASIK for 8 to 9 diopters of myopia in 2003, was spectacle free for about an year, and started having again diminution of vision in both eyes during pregnancy, and presented to us her clinic in 2012 with the visual acuity of 6/6 in the right eye and a refractive error of 5.5 myopia, and -7 with very high cylinder in the left eye with the best acuity of 6/36. And on clinical examination, gross examination, you don't see anything grossly, and on slit examination, you don't see any evidence of cataract. So the possible diagnosis she put together was it could be either post-LASIK ectasia or a regression, or it could be because of nuclear cataract, or it could be axial myopia. This is the topography of the two eye. On the right side, you can see there are hardly any anterior elevation, and the K reading are fairly normal. In the left eye, we have inferior temporal steepening with the maximum K reading of 53.7, and on the Bailey-Namburzo map, you can see a posterior elevation in the left eye. So a diagnosis of post-LASIK ectasia was made in the left eye and a long-term regression in the right eye. And how we differentiate between the two is there is no loss of best corrected visual acuity in the long-term regression. Wherever there is a loss of this best corrected visual acuity in LASIK ectasia, and there is a progressive steepening and thinning of the cornea, which is absent in long-term regression. And so we did a C3R in the left eye, and the right eye was kept under observation and prescribed glasses. This is the preoperative K reading, and after the C3R, there was a flattening of around 2.3 diopter in this eye after 28 months, almost 2.5 years. And this is a final reflection after the C3R, and she improved to 6.9. There was a drastic decrease in the cylinder, as you can see in this case. And so just to emphasize, there is hardly any different protocol in post-LASIK eye, though one study do say that we can lift a flap for around 2 to 3 millimeter and inject the dye within the pocket and do the cross-linking for a shorter duration, but the results were not so promising. Only thing in these cases to be careful is if we are doing a epithelial off cross-linking, we should try to avoid removing the epithelium at the flap junction, because sometimes there could be a once you are stroking the epithelium, there could be a risk of flap coming off, or later on there could be a little contraction of the flap, or there could be a risk of epithelial growth following post-LASIK C3R in these cases. But if you are doing in thin corneas, contact lens assisted or transepithelial, then that risk is much. And this is one of the largest studies published in on cross-linking in post-LASIK eye. They included this recent study published in 2017 by Peter Hirsch et al. They include almost 179 patients with post-LASIK activity and divided into two groups: CXL group, the standard protocol group, a Dresden protocol they followed, and the other group they didn't give any treatment at all. And in the results, they could found that more than 2 diopter in almost 18% of the cases and increased by 2 diopter in 4%. So even after the treatment, there was an increased progression of the disease. And in treatment group, almost 32%, one third of the eyes gained 2 line of best corrected visual acuity, while these 4% of the eyes which had increase in refraction, they lost more than 2 lines. And the conclusion of the study was that corneal collagen cross-linking was effective in improving the maximum K value, corrected distance acuity, and uncorrected distance visual acuity in eyes with corneal ectasia 1 year after treatment with an excellent safety profile. This is just in graphic form. They have shown that almost 40 patients had a decrease in K rating from almost by 1 diopter, and gradually the K rating, the average decrease in K was 2.6 diopter in combined cases. And in another study, post-LASIK eye, they have shown that the post-LASIK ectasia, the CXL, C3R, stabilize the corneal, the cornea, the progression of the disease is concerned, and there was an improvement in visual acuity in these cases. And in another study, they found that the most of the patients who are likely to benefit by C3R in post-LASIK eyes where the pre-operative, before doing C3R in these post-LASIK the visual acuity was better, and the Kmax was better than.
Where is the screen share option? Which one? This share screen. Okay. वहाँ से
Okay. This is the last slide on this. Is it visible?
the time wait.
But we have
Yeah.
downloaded the presentation first on the laptop.
उसमें सारे videos हैं. I can't do it
Is
directly.
it?
I'm sorry, the people who are looking after the coordination of this hall, we can hear other voices.
Okay.
Inasha?
All right. So I thought something is wrong. Okay. And then this study by Peter Hirsch et al., they showed that keratoconus patients showed more improvement in topographic measures as compared to the eyes with post-LASIK ectasia. And the reason they postulated that the biomechanical difference caused by the LASIK flap, because the LASIK flap doesn't add to the biomechanical strength of the cornea, and the possible difference in the riboflavin diffusion rate in the post-LASIK cornea, especially in the interface, may make a difference. And there could be, as we know, these post-LASIK ectasia patients are cornea collagen is maybe a little different. So the intrinsic pathophysiological differences between keratoconus, keratoconus and post-LASIK ectasia eyes may be making a difference as far as the recovery is concerned. So basically speaking, there is a practically no difference in the way we do C3R. We follow the same guideline as you will follow with the thin cornea or with the normal corneal thickness, but probably the result may not be as good in post-LASIK eye as in the virgin ectasia. So should I continue with my next talk?
Yes, sir, please. We'll then discuss it after that.
So the next talk is on the complications of
So you'll have to
C3.
stop sharing this slide.
I have to stop share first.
Uh,
Is it visible?
yes.
I think it should be visible. Is it visible?
No, not now.
Okay, I will again. I have to stop share and then start again.
Yes, now it's fine. Now it's visible.
Okay. All right. All right. So this talk is on how much time I have.
So we have
Now?
plenty. We
Okay,
have
okay.
plenty of time. You can take your time. Yeah.
In full, I don't have. I mean, the count of time. Okay. So, what are the complications of corneal collagen cross-linking? We can divide these complications of C3R into basically three groups. These are inflammatory in nature, which could uh, be pain, corneal edema, and sterile infiltrates. And because the delayed healing process, there could be delayed epithelialization, or which can also lead to a corneal haze. And the third and very important one is the risk of infective keratitis and reactivation of herpetic keratitis. And same complication can be again categorized into early and late group, depending on whether they are presenting early or late. So we will take most important ones one by one. And post-operative pain is the very common complaint, which is worse on the day of surgery and gradually improves on day 5. And it's more in younger patients, as the bar diagram shows that pain reduces considerably over a period of 4 to 5 days. And it is because of exposure of corneal nerve after epithelial debridement and inflammatory mediator which is released after the procedure, as well as photochemical damage because of the ultraviolet light. And how we can prevent is we can give topical analgesia 30 minutes before the procedure in the form of diclofenac eye drops topically. And also intraoperatively, one can use riboflavin dye, which is at 4-degree cooled riboflavin dye, which also is a little soothing for the patient also, and shown to be having a less pain post-operatively. And how to manage this post-operative pain is we do apply a bandage contact lens so that the surface is covered, and we do prescribe non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. And if there is too much of pain, one can give oral gabapentin or ketorolac eye drops. Then coming to the corneal haze, it could be early or late. And early haze is most common. It doesn't affect the vision much, and it's seen in almost all cases and usually clears in 6 to 12 months. But the late haze, which is less common, but it is clinically significant, it is slow, and usually incomplete clearing happens, usually persists for a long time. And the risk factor for corneal haze are if patient has advanced keratoconus of grade 3 to 4, as earlier said, poor initial uncorrected distance visual acuity or corrected distance visual acuity, and if there are preoperative reticular microstria on confocal microscopy, these are the patients who are more prone to develop corneal haze. And the mechanism I have shown in this flow diagram on the right hand side, that as we cross-link the collagen fibers, their diameter increases and the space between the fibril increases. This increase to the increased backscattering as well as reflectance of light, which is clinically seen as reduced corneal transparencies, and we see it as a haze on the slit lamp examination. depending on the severity of this haze and how much clarity of iris you can see, we can divide it into 4 different grades from mild to very severe. And earlier corneal haze, as we said, it happens in almost all cases, and it usually declines by 6 to 12 months of time. And clinically, it appears as very fine mid-stromal to anterior stromal corneal opacity anterior to the demarcation line. And the management of this is nothing special is required to do this. The routine treatment which we give in the form of topical steroid post-operatively usually clears this off, and we should advise patient to use goggles, ultraviolet protective goggles in the sunlight. But the persistent haze is which is happens late is more, uh, it affects the visual acuity more as compared to the initial transient haze, and the incidence is around 8.6%, and it hampers the vision to a large extent. And if it doesn't disappear in very severe cases, we may require corneal transplant in these cases. And the risk factor again for this corneal haze is we have already highlighted the advanced keratoconus, preoperative stromal microstriae, as well as preoperative activated keratocyte, like if there is a uncontrolled VKC and other thing. And the stromal scar incidence is to the tune of 2.9%, and it may not be related to a cross-linking. It may be just related to the keratoconus process and corneal remodeling in the cases of keratoconus. And this is one case from, again, Dr. Chintan's clinic, showing a corneal haze which developed after the C3R. Patient had a 636 vision on post-op day 3, and haze gradually decreased, though here we are seeing it in a slit view, so it appears more than the left one, but it actually decreased, and patient's vision improved to 6.9 up to the follow-up of 3 years. Then the next complication, or we can see, is delayed epithelialization. This is the case from my clinic. As you can see, we have a heaped up margin of the epithelium. Once the epithelium doesn't heal for more than 10 days, we label it as a delayed epithelial healing, and the risk factors are already enumerated here: the old age, very steep K readings, active preoperative inflammation, uncontrolled VKC, ocular surface disorder, and especially patient of atopic dermatitis, or if there is a limbal stem cell deficiency already there. Another very important complication is we can have a sterile infiltrate. Again, usually the onset is around on an average after 3 days post-op, and they usually appear as gray-white circumlimbal lesion. I'll just take another 1 minute. Uh, you can have present it. The symptoms are pain, redness, and photophobia, and they usually appear at the margin of the epithelial debridement. And the mechanism again is usually sometimes said to be because of immune reaction to staphylococcal antigen, or hypersensitivity reaction to the riboflavin, or phototoxic effect on the corneal stroma. And again, the risk factors are again epithelium we are again damaging, and chronic inflammation like blepharitis and VKC, and prolonged use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. This is another patient presenting with peripheral infiltrate, and this study has highlighted the various risk factors for sterile corneal infiltrates, and the most important risk factor is VKC, uncontrolled blepharitis, and as we have already highlighted, the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory disease. And the corneal edema, this is one of the most important and vision-threatening complication of the C3R, and usually starts within 24 hours and may increase up to 2 to 3 weeks and may not resolve. And the risk factor involved are thin cornea, less than 400 micron, inadvertent excessive energy delivery, or the improper focusing of the beam of the ultraviolet on the cornea, or if there is a intraoperative corneal thinning because of dehydration. That's why hydration is very important throughout the procedure. And in accurate pachymetry measurement, we may be overestimating the corneal thickness, and poor focusing, and if there is a pre-existing fuchs endothelial dystrophy. And various preventive measures we can take is to ensure the corneal thickness, remove the lid speculum during riboflavin installation, timely, time and again, we should check the equipment calibration that proper energy is being delivered. It is not delivering high energy, and frequent intraoperative check of corneal thickness during the procedure, and administration of hypertonic solution if the thickness drops less than 350 micron. And this is one of the most dreaded complications, though it's rare. And these are the risk factors for the infective keratitis, immunocompromised patient. They are not following the treatment properly, topical use of steroid, as well as the use of contact lens and other things. And the reactivation of herpes keratitis, again, these are 3 cases of, recurrence of keratitis. All types of keratitis can reoccur, though epithelial keratitis is more common after CTR than the stromal, reactivating stromal or endothelial herpes simplex keratitis. This is one case which showed recurrence of the disease, which are treated with the typical standard treatment of antiviral treatment. There's another dendritic epithelial keratitis case. And this case of 21-year female, she had herpetic endothelitis after the 7 weeks after the after the C3R. This thing you can see fine KPs and fine corneal in this case. And just last slide, and this is one case of disciform keratitis which happened following the C3R, again from Dr. Chintan's clinic. And then there could be a visual complications where there's a decrease in visual acuity by 2 lines. Again, the risk factors are older age group and best corrected vision more than 20/25 preoperatively. And there could be treatment failure of C3R, especially in cases older people where the Kmax is more than 58 diopters, and especially where the cones are paracentral. And the rare complications are corneal melt or corneal perforation, excessive corneal flattening, or limbal stem cell deficiency. And this is one case, this is a rare complication where there is a extreme stromal thinning following C3R. And there's a rare complication of one case reported in literature of development of neoplasia after deep anterior lamellar keratoplasts in C3R treated cornea. So thank you very much. Sorry for the little overshooting the time.
No problem, sir. I think we have to wind this session up at 2:25. So we still have 15 minutes for all of you for the discussion and panel discussion.
Yeah. We, I think, have one more talk. So as Dr. Amit and Professor Jain would say, should I go ahead with my talk and then we'll take the questions?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead with the talk. And then if we, whatever time we have, we can have a discussion.
Yes, thank you. So the last talk for this IC, I just thought that there are some issues which remain untouched in all talks. And that is basically some dilemmas which we face, cross-linking conundrums, and some tips and tricks to take away. Now, for the people who just start cross-linking, it's important to realize that in addition to cross-linking, what else does CXL do? So it also causes apoptosis and cell death. We can see the images on the top panel are the keratocytes and the endothelium from an untreated cornea. And we see at the bottom panel, this is the first 100 microns of the anterior stroma, which we see it's completely devoid of keratocytes. In the mid stroma also, there are no keratocytes seen here, but we can see the swollen stromal lamellae. And in the deepest stroma, we have the activated keratocytes. And our aim is that all these effects should not go up to the endothelium. So the aim of a successful procedure is to maximize the cross-linking and to minimize the collateral damage. Now, the other thing is, what about the dye that we use? Dextran riboflavin or hypoosmolar riboflavin? Does it even matter? And should we even bother? So to answer this question, we have to look at both experimental evidence as well as its clinical relevance, if there is any. Now, this was a study which was published in JRS in 2017, and this was done on porcine eyes, porcine corneoscleral rims basically, and it had two very important findings. So they compared dextran riboflavin versus HPMC riboflavin, because now the more and more the riboflavins, that solutions that we get are coming in at HPMC. So they showed that the dextran riboflavin was more concentrated in the anterior stroma, up to 70 to 80 micrometers, whereas the HPMC riboflavin was more concentrated in the posterior stroma, that is it went up to deep, up to 260 micrometers. And the other thing they showed was that the HPMC based solutions diffused more rapidly. So the concentration in the stroma of HPMC after 10 minutes was equivalent to what could be obtained with a dextran riboflavin after 30 minutes. Some of these findings have translated into clinical observations, perhaps unrelated, but they reflect the same pattern. So there were these two publications, the one on top by Hegum et al., which was published in 2017. And just a few months after that, we published our observations in, again, JCRS in the next few issues. Now, what did these two publications have to show us? So Hegum et al. Noted that they used HPMC riboflavin, and they noted that deep structural changes were seen with absence of keratocytes on confocal microscopy in a large proportion of the patients. So in fact, in up to 42% of the eyes, up to the pre-endothelial levels, there were no keratocytes seen, which means the depth of the CXL had penetrated that far, at least the apoptotic changes. And also they compared the accelerated versus the conventional group, and they saw that the changes were more pronounced in the group undergoing conventional procedures. Thus, the exposure time to UVA was also important. And as part of the conclusion of their study or the observation of the study, the authors mentioned that the use of methyl cellulose riboflavin might explain the deep alterations and raise a long-term safety concern. Why this is important is that previously a few studies in 2009, again in experimental eyes, had shown that perhaps HPMC is safer for thinner corneas, and it was even recommended because it was more stable. The tear film was, the riboflavin film was more stable, and it again penetrated faster. Our observation, which was published again a few months later, was, so we were doing contact lens assisted CXL, and it was a retrospective comparison. Initially, we had been using dextran, and then we were using HPMC riboflavin. And we saw that the demarcation line with HPMC riboflavin was much deeper. And this was statistically significant. There was almost an 80 to 90 micron difference. And the demarcation line again was predesmatic, as we can see in the image to our right. Now, the learning point from this is that HPMC riboflavin causes deeper structural effects than dextran riboflavin. We need to be aware of this, which riboflavin we are using, although there are as yet no predefined protocols, but a few studies have suggested that in epi-off cross-linking especially in thin corneas, if we are using HPMC, the soakage time may be reduced from 30 minutes to 15 to 20 minutes prior to UV exposure when HPMC riboflavin is used. Though there are no clear-cut guidelines on this, but we need to keep this in mind. Then what about transepithelial CXL? What was a disadvantage could prove to be an advantage in another situation. So earlier reports indicated that shallower demarcation lines have been seen with transepithelial CXL, but most of these studies used dextran-based riboflavin dyes. And it's been shown again in experimental studies that as opposed to dextran riboflavin, the HPMC containing solutions enhance the stromal penetration of riboflavin. In transepithelial, we know that the epithelium tends to hinder the absorption of riboflavin into the stroma. And now it is So all the dyes, riboflavin, that solutions, not dyes, the riboflavin solutions that we see do come with HPMC, and it is recommended that transepithelial CXL should not be performed with a dextran riboflavin. They should be with an HPMC riboflavin. And in fact, I believe that all riboflavins now, which the manufacturers propose for transepithelial, do have HPMC in them. And so our experience has again been that the demarcation lines that we were seeing, as opposed to the previous literature, that we had 75% depth, and we saw very well demarcated and delineated demarcation lines in transepithelial CXL up to the tune of 70 to 75%, which is the same as conventional CXL. And this we had published in the International Journal of Keratoconus and Ectatic Corneal Diseases. And I believe that this is because of the use of HPMC riboflavin, combined with the fact that the transepithelial riboflavin has a higher concentration, that is 0.25 rather than a 0.1% of riboflavin. The third thing, just a small tip, is how do we know if cross-linking has succeeded or failed? We look at morphological parameters, functional, anatomical, and corneal. And one of the most important things we look at is a tendency is to look at keratometry. So we see the keratometry. If the K-mean or the K-max decreases, we tend to declare it a success, and if it increases, we tend to declare it a failure, because that's the cornea is steepening. So this is what we would classically see. The middle panel shows a patient before CXL. The panel on the left shows a patient after CXL, and we can see on the extreme right that the flattening of the cone has occurred. This is how we would conventionally follow up a patient. Now, this is an example. So a patient pre-CXL in the center, 6 weeks after CXL, and we can see central steepening. Now, is this treatment failure? So a word of caution, initial steepening of keratometry values is often seen in the first 6 to 8 weeks. And this is believed to be due to stromal remodeling of the collagen fibers or even epithelial remodeling. But gradually it tends to settle down, as can be seen in the same patient which I showed previously. So at 6 weeks, we have an apparent steepening. And then at 3 months compared to CXL, we still see some amount of steepening, but that hasn't decreased from 4.7 to 1.5. And I'm sorry, I don't have the later follow-up of this patient, but then it gradually went on to flattening as compared to the pre-CXL values. So it's important to know that pseudo steepening can be seen in the initial period, and hence, and this is just to highlight the difference after 3 months, and hence a period of at least 6 months is required to adequately assess if the corneal topography is stabilizing or progressing, and let's not be in a hurry to declare cross-linking a failure. The other thing is that post-CXL corneal pachymetry values are also often less than the procedure values in the initial period, and this again should not be mistaken for progression. The apparent lack of corneal thickness may be because of increased compaction of stromal fibers, a fallacious measurement because of which the haze occurs initially, or a combination of both. This was a slide which I had skipped over in the initial presentation. Do we do transepithelial in CXL? In pediatric patients? I myself am not sure. I would like the opinion of Professor Amit and Dr. Jain also on this. What literature tells us is that a lot of studies tell us that both procedures are comparable. None really shows that it is better, and a couple show that it is not as good as transepithelial CXL. So I am myself not clear about whether we should go ahead with transepithelial in pediatrics, especially if it is very aggressive. I think the epi-off technique, if the corneal thickness permits, would be better. So the only clear-cut indication for transepithelial perhaps is a patient with a thin cornea, and apprehensive patients with Down syndrome, where we may not be able to follow up an epithelial thinning. Pediatric is, I think, one would depend on one's own experience. We have started doing it more and more, but literature does not give us very clear guidelines as of now. And the last thing, other decisions to consider, cross-linking, which I think Dr. Amit has already mentioned, just a reiteration of that, is also important in a case with a perceived risk of progression. So that is important. For example, if you see a young child with a very severe VKC, a deterioration of visual acuity is not required. And these are the recommendations of the global consensus. There is no age below or above which CXL should be done or not done if we see progression, and no visual acuity also above which it should not be done if we do document progression. So basically, if there's a significant risk of progression, then cross-linking can be done. And the last is that what I was mentioning earlier, if one has access to epithelial mapping, one can do a preoperative epithelial mapping, because we know that the epithelium tends to thin over the cone, to see what is the epithelium over the thinnest area of the cone, and how much would it decrease, how much would the stromal thickness decrease intraoperatively once we remove the epithelium. Of course, this can be combined and should be combined with intraoperative tachymetry. So these are some of the things which one should keep in mind probably while doing CXL. Thank you very much.
Sure, ma'am. So we still have 5 minutes for the panel discussion.
Yes, thank
Questions
you.
and answers.
One clarification, Dr. Chintan. So, like we are saying, the transepithelial should be done with the in thin corneas with the methyl cellulose containing dye. So, do you think once the cornea is thin, and one can use the dextran containing dye so that we can take care of the toxicity part, because the epithelial demarcation line is shallower in dextran containing dye as compared to those? I have no idea.
Yes, I think so. There is actually no clear-cut answer to this in literature also, because dextran also has been shown to decrease the corneal thickness. It compacts the cornea by around 10 to 15%, whereas methyl cellulose, on the other hand, by intraop measurements, has been shown to at least maintain the corneal thickness or increase it even by 5 to 10%. So what has been suggested in a lot of publications which I've gone through is that if you are doing thin cornea and you're doing with HPMC, then you can reduce the soakage time because it penetrates much faster. So instead of the 30 minutes, you could reduce the soakage time to 10 to 15 minutes so that it remains kind of limited to the anterior two-third, and that would take care of it. I am now currently doing all cross-linkings with the HPMC, and we don't have any problems as such, but and transepithelial especially, because HPMC helps to increase penetration, so that's an advantage.
So is there any difference in rate of sort of corneal edema? Because what we have seen is with methyl cellulose, the demarcation line is almost to the pre-Descemet's level, compared to the dextran earlier version where the line was almost in the middle up to 300. So
this, the pre-Descemetic was seen with the epi-off procedures. In fact, in the transepithelial, the cornea next day appears very, very pristine. There's, to my experience, the epithelium is shining and there's hardly any corneal edema. And in fact, sometimes you have to re-look whether anything actually has been done. That's been my experience.
Is that the recommendation that you do a transepithelial methyl cellulose, so that because we have long-term results of sort of transepithelial cross-linking with methyl cellulose versus without contact lens?
And also, there are not too many studies on it. I am not at least aware of them. There are the transepithelials and the dextran. People have just...
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
What
hear
about
you.
the population of keratocytes? Because number of keratocytes damage will be much more once the demarcation line is up to the pre-Descemet's. So all those things can make a difference.
Yes, so that is the protocols are exactly, but with transepithelial, we've seen the demarcation line at around 70%, I think. Dr. Amit, I think you were saying something?
Yeah, I use a fair amount of dextran based. The thing is it such a good idea to get rid of all the keratocytes till the pre-Descemet's level, like Professor Jain is saying? There's so many things about cross-linking we just don't know.
Yeah.
We do know that the majority of the biomechanical strength of the cornea is in the anterior part of the cornea. We know that. And the efficacy wise, I think it works extremely well. And considering that so many years have passed since HPMC has come and it diffuses so fast, yet there is not a single protocol which says that you reduce the timing to less than 30 minutes. I don't know why. I'm not really aware whether there is a clear-cut
all
guide.
Publications, wherever they've used, they have suggested. So there are no clear guidelines. That's what I mentioned.
After so many years, also people are simply suggesting. Just having a look at the demarcation line, which is pre-Descemet's, I think does not really indicate how effective a procedure is.
Yes, the demarcation line may not necessarily be.
And as you said on confocal, if we get rid of all the keratocytes, I do not know what is going to be the physiological and physical implication of that.
Yes.
And
Sorry
my
to interrupt
another-
you, sir. Just request you to conclude the session with the final comments because our next speakers are ready for the next session.
Okay, Dr. Chintan.
Yes, thank you. Then I think we won't keep the next speakers waiting. And hello, ma'am, Dr. Vanati, I can see you. And so we'll just end the session. And thank you, sir and Dr. Amit for being here. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. We would like to thank all of you for joining us for this session.